All right, next slide, Lisa. We'll just go through this presentation really fast. So my name is Mika, and Lisa is also co-hosting this event. We are both pediatric dental residents, and we will be your Wilderness Explorer guides for this presentation. So some rules, this is a webinar format, so please turn your video and sound off. If you have any questions, please drop it in the chat function, which I think some of you are familiar with based on what I've been reading so far. We will be answering all the questions at 10 o'clock, 10 to 10:15, but I will be monitoring the chat. If you would like to change your view, use the view options in the top right corner. Just be kind and considerate and respectful, and all workshops will be recorded as long as with the handout and the materials. If you need live transcript, on the bottom of your screen, look for the CC live transcript button and click on the up arrow to open a new window. Click on show subtitle and the captions will be on the screen, and then you can turn off the subtitles by hiding them. And then this is our evaluation form. Please fill this out at the end of the presentation. Also, we will have random prizes for you all. So please stay on till the end and you will be may be selected for a prize. And last but not least, we have our two wonderful presenters, Dr. Jeffrey Okamoto, who is a behavioral pediatrician from Kapiolani and Vice President of the Hawaii American Academy of Pediatrics. And we also have Verna Chinen from the Hawaii State DOE, a state teacher and a preschool specialist. So let's give a warm welcome to those two.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Verna Chinen, and I will be speaking first. And I'm going to be speaking about developmental delay from the Department of Education perspective. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, we will be starting off with some definitions of developmental delay. Then we will be talking about laws and regulations, and I'll keep that really simple and sweet. And then we're going to go into developmental delay criteria as it pertains to the Department of Education and our obligations. And lastly, we will be going over some exclusionary criteria. When I'm completed, then Dr. Okamoto will take over. So let's begin with just a really broad definition of what is developmental delay. And basically it means that a child is slow to meet or is not reaching developmental milestones in one or more of the areas of development in the way we would expect of any child. So there are developmental norms that we follow, and that's what we're looking for, someone who is not meeting those developmental milestones. Within the Department of Education, I'm sure many of you know that there are two laws that we need to adhere to, and one is IDEA, and that's our federal law, and we also have to adhere to our state law, which we call Chapter 60. And so any state agency, such as the Department of Health and the Department of Education, are the agencies that need to adhere to these laws. And we provide special early intervention as well as special education and related services to children with disabilities. So just keep that in mind. We have the two laws that we need to adhere to. Sometimes there's some questions about what's the difference between early intervention, Part C, which is for our little ones, and the school age law, which is for children from 3 years old all the way up to the age of 22. Early intervention are services to infants and toddlers and their families, whereas As I said with the Department of Education, once a child turns 3, then it becomes our responsibility for children with disabilities. And today we're specifically talking about those children who meet the eligibility criteria for developmental delay, and those are children who are 3 to 5 as well as 6 to 8. Early intervention, when we talk about eligibility, they're looking at developmental delays from a child who has been diagnosed with a medical condition or has a very high probability of having a developmental delay. And with these numbers here, section 632(5)(a), that is the law that we are required, that early intervention is required to follow when they are determining eligibility for services. In the Hawaii Department of Education, we also have criteria that we need to follow, and it's based on education. So we're looking at, does this child have a disability which is impacting or it's severely affecting the child's ability to participate in general education or participate with their typically developing peers, or for the little ones, with age-appropriate activities? How does one then become eligible for services? In the Department of Health, Part C, with the little guys, there's a multidisciplinary team which includes the families to develop an individualized family service plan. So emphasis on the word family there. With the school-age children, there are qualified professionals. So it depends on what the concern is. We're pulling in those professionals who can address the concern, including the parents, to look at whether or not they're eligible, and then to develop an individualized education plan. So again, emphasis on the word education. So what is the focus? The focus for Part C, early intervention, is really to maximize the family's ability to understand what does it mean to have a disability and care for their child's developmental needs. That's why the criteria is different. For school-age children, we're looking at the provision of a free, appropriate public education. So again, we're looking at educational services. So let's take a look at what does it mean to have a developmental delay under the federal law. So the federal law says that any child aged 3 through 9 who's experiencing developmental delays as defined by the state. So that's the intersection between the federal law and the state. So IDEA allows each state to come up with their definition of developmental delay and use this definition with children from ages 3 to 9, or any portion of this age range if they choose. So every state is different. I could go to California and their interpretation of developmental delay will be different from Hawaii. I go to Iowa and it's different. Some states will say 3 to 5, other states might say 3 to 9. So it really is different, but we all have to adhere to what the federal law says, 3 through 9. So the next thing is, within the Hawaii Department of Education, our state said that a child needs to, who is 3 to 5 years old, will meet the eligibility criteria for developmental delay if they meet one of the following areas. So motor development is delayed, communication is delayed, academic development is delayed, or adaptive. So any one of these areas, there is a delay, we will see if the child is eligible for that category for services. So let me go into a little bit more detail about this. When we're talking about fine motor delays, we're talking about a child having delays in the 3 main areas of what we consider motor milestones. Fine motor, which is using our small muscles, for cutting, scribbling, using utensils to feed themselves. In other words, using their small muscles. When we go into gross motor, we're talking about their large muscles. So how are they running and walking and jumping and skipping? So all of your big muscles. And then when we talk about perceptual motor, we're talking about those skills in which they're coordinating all of their motor skills to interact with their environment. So really, how do I coordinate all of my movements, given that there's sounds in the environment and there's things that I need to look at, those kinds of things. Then I can look at communication. So remember, it can be in communication. So when we talk about delays in that particular area, we're expecting that somebody who's between the ages of 3 to 5, I would begin to understand the majority of what they're saying. And that's for an unfamiliar listener. That at about 3 years old, I can pretty much understand about 75% of what they're saying. And that's later 3 years old. When we're talking about their language, we're talking about how much they understand. Can they talk about what's going on right now, here and now? So if I'm eating cookies or if I'm eating a salad, I can talk about what I'm eating. Or if we went to the playground, I can talk about what I'm doing on the playground. And we expect that their vocabulary is growing. So 3 to 5 years old, they are just growing immensely in vocabulary development. So what I'm listening for is, are new words being added every day? Are they combining words? And they're just kind of nonstop talkers. That's what I'm looking for. And like I said, they're using sentences, combining their words. So if there's a delay in those two areas, in their speech and their communication, that could be a signal for developmental delay. When we talk about academic skills, we're not talking about can they do their math, can they do their, can they read? They're a little bit too young for that yet. But I'm looking at whether or not they are developing those underlying skills that will prepare them to read. So we in the profession call it phonological awareness. Can they hear the sounds? Can they understand the differences between sounds when they're speaking? A lot of rhyming, and can they sing songs and those kinds of things? We're looking at whether or not they're paying attention to books and they are recognizing that the words in the books have meaning. We're looking at whether or not they're beginning to sing ABC songs, so that's some alphabet knowledge. Are they scribbling? Are they holding those pencils, pens, markers, chalk? And are they communicating? Again, there's overlap at this age between communication and the development of academic skills. And lastly, we're looking at adaptive behavior skills. And those are what we call our social emotional skills. Can they follow directions? Can they play with other children? Are they adapting to change? 3 to 5 years old, they should be kind of coming out of that, what we call the terrible twos, the temper tantrums and things, because now their communication is growing so they can express themselves a little bit better. And now I can explain to them about transitions and we're going to do something else. And then their toileting and hygiene skills should be coming along. Not to say that they won't have accidents, but they really should be moving along in their development. So again, developmental delay for the 3 or 5 year olds, it can be in any one of these areas. Okay. When we talk about those then who are 6 to 8 years old, developmental delay is a little bit different because now we're looking at 3 or more of these areas having to be impacted. So 3 or more. So remember with the 3 to 5 years old, 5-year-olds, it was 1. When they reach 6 to 8, it has to be in 3 of these areas. So that's where people get a little bit confused sometimes, like, why is it that it becomes a little bit more rigorous in terms of the criteria? Well, it's because at this age where their children are already in school, and it's assumed that the school will kind of have an idea of where this child is academically. So if we're looking at motor skills, notice the difference. Now we're talking about writing, and or if they're still having some difficulty with handling those writing utensils, keyboarding. In addition to that, some gross motor skills. So again, the large muscles, skipping, hopping, jump roping, those kinds of things. And those perceptual skills, using those muscles to interact with their environment. So copying off of the blackboard or moving around in the environment without bumping into the other children, navigating through the school campus. Communication, again, we're starting to look at whether or not the children can follow the directions in the classroom. Are they able to speak clearly? By the time they're 6 years old, we should be able to understand everything that they're saying, particularly when they're speaking to somebody who's not familiar to them. Their language, they should be able to understand what the teacher is saying. They should be able to explain what they're learning. They should be able to engage with other children and peers as well as adults. Academically, now we're looking at some real academic, the reading, the writing, the spelling. We're moving into those academic skills. And really, again, there's overlap between communication and academics. So it's whether or not the children can understand what the teacher is teaching and really explain what the teacher has taught to show that they have the knowledge and skills that the teacher has taught. We're also looking at adaptive behaviors. So again, those social emotional skills, interacting and playing with others, following school rules, transitioning between classes or transitioning from a math activity to a science activity, those kinds of things. Those are all of the expectations that we have of school-age children. Then when it comes to cognition, it's are they showing us that they're thinking, can they solve problems? Are they remembering their math facts? You know, those kinds of things. All of these things come into play. Are they able to organize their thoughts? At this time, the children are beginning to write, so it'll show up in their writing. Are they organized in their writing or even in their daily activities? We have some children who, you know, are just, their desk is a total mess, and versus they don't really know how to organize it. Teacher says, okay, everybody pull out your textbook, and they spend a lot of time just trying to find their textbook because of the lack of organizational skills. So these are the kinds of criteria that we're looking at. Of course, because of the age range, 6 to 8 years old, they will be at different stages, but these are the big bucket items that we're looking at. And for developmental delay, 6 through 8, these are the kinds of things that we're looking for in any 3 of these areas. Okay. The law also requires us to use a variety of assessment tools. So when we're looking at those areas that I described, it's not taking a test. It's asking us to really use a whole bunch of information that we pull together to organize it. So we look at observations. We go into the classroom, we're seeing how they're doing on a day-to-day basis. If it's for a real little one, a 3 to 5 year old, we might go into their natural environment, home, playground, those kinds of things. Lots of dependency on parent interviews. And so we might do checklists with the parents, just sit down and talk story to find out a little bit more about their developmental history. And lastly, we do some tests. But basically what we're doing is we're pulling all of that information together to get a picture, a real comprehensive picture of the child. IDEA and Chapter 60 both require us to say, okay, first, is there a disability? And that's from all of that information that we gather from parents, from teachers, from observations. That will help us define, is there a disability per the criteria that's set forth in IDEA in Chapter 60. Then we have to look at educational impact. How is it impacting for the real little ones, their ability to participate with peers in their natural environment and grow and learn? For the 6 to 8-year-olds, it's looking at, is it impacting their ability to do math, to do reading, to interact with peers? So that's the educational impact. And the third criteria is, does this child need special education and related services? All three of these criteria need to be met in order for us to say a child has a disability and needs special education services. So it's really all connected. The last thing I wanted to say, though, is that with the eligibility criteria, the law also requires us to really look at what we call some exclusionary clauses. And so we cannot say that a child has a disability if it is due to their lack of exposure for the little ones, or for the slightly older ones due to a lack of appropriate instruction in reading and writing. We also cannot say that a child has special education needs if their primary issue is due to limited English proficiency. So a child has just moved over, say, from another country, and they've never been exposed to English. We cannot immediately say, well, this child has a disability if English is the primary barrier to their learning. We cannot say that if there are environmental or economic disadvantages, and that is the primary cause to their learning issues, we have to say, we have to rule out that the learning is not due to environmental or economic disadvantage, as well as cultural differences. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the criteria that the Department of Education is required to follow when it comes to developmental delay. So I thank you for listening to this part of the presentation, and now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Okamoto.
Thanks so much, Verna. That's a great orientation to this subject. And I think my talk is going to build upon a lot of things that Verna talked about. So my outline for my part of the talk is, why isn't developmental delay a category after 8 years of age? And then areas of development that can be delayed, which I think actually Verna covered very nicely already. So we can kind of go by that, but we can talk a little more about reasons for developmental delay. And we already had a chat about, can we outgrow developmental delay? And that kind of depends on the reasons for the developmental delay. So we'll kind of go into that. And what I like about our talk, it really illustrates the interface between the medical road, which I'll try to represent, and Verna's road, which she's immersed within the DOE and the educational road. And there's quite a bit of overlap and things that we need to do to work together to make sure things work out for our kids. Okay, so developmental delay is a description. So, Verna was going over all the different areas that you can be delayed in, and, we can describe kids. It's really not really a condition. Conditions have to meet certain criteria, so we'll go over that. But when children are younger, it's much harder to assess kids. And so we are often very much stuck on whether or not we're really measuring what they can or cannot do, or whether or not they want to or not want to do, right? So we can use developmental delay initially, but we really have to figure out if there's something else going on. And we use this criteria book called the DSM-5, and it actually has a global developmental delay part. and a criteria for that, but it's only reserved for kids under 5. And that's because we just cannot reliably assess kids during early childhood. So what Verna was talking about with assessments are really important. And I'll sort of go over that a little bit more and elaborate on what kind of assessments we're going to want to do while kids are getting older. So this is kind of to answer the chat, which is, a lot of parents think that their kids are going to catch up when they hear that term developmental delay. My child's delayed, but it's not going to be delayed after a while. And that may be true. And Verna had a very nice slide about the things that we have to be very smart about, like cultural things and language issues. And, maybe kids just didn't have that much exposure to things that would help their development. But if a child actually has some kind of medical condition, some kind of brain injury, they were born premature, a lot of reasons for kids to have a particular medical condition, a lot of those do not go away. So I have a lot of trouble in my clinic actually about this term developmental delay, because it can kind of be, sort of misleading. Okay, so Verna already talked about this, so I don't think I have to go over. There's lots of areas that can be delayed. So again, it's a description. Developmental delay is a description. And the way we figure out if somebody's delayed is kind of two ways. One is to compare a child and their development with developmental milestones. We know that there are certain things that happen at certain ages. And so those are milestones for the children. You tend to walk by 1. So there's certain milestones. And the other way to figure out developmental delay out is using standardized assessments. So I'll go over those. So how do younger children get identified? Well, we can have parents or professionals do surveillance where they use milestones, or we can have a professional use a screening tool where we use standardized assessment. So developmental surveillance, what that idea is about is that we know there are certain things that happen by certain ages, and you would compare a particular child with these milestones. For example, at 1 year of age, they hopefully will be saying mama and dada, maybe 2 other words. Some kids will, follow a 1-step command with gestures, imitate gestures, stand alone. So there's a number of milestones. Now, for some kids, they're actually normal and they're not making some of these. And some kids are actually abnormal and they're making these. So these are not very, sort of firm rules. This kind of like more of a guideline. And then we also use tools in developmental screening. And for us physicians, we really need to use it from birth to 5 years of age, as the schools is probably the best screening tool for kids who are in the school age group. But when kids are not yet either in preschool or some kind of setting, then we need to do some screening. And most pediatricians in our state are using a screening tool called PEDS, or Ages and Stages. And the Department of Health also does quite a bit of screening on kids in preschools and other places. And they're mostly using Ages and Stages. So I thought I'd show some examples of those. So this is called the PEDS. And it's only a 1-page thing. What I like about this kind of screening tool is that it's parent driven. So the parent sort of knows their child really well and they can answer these questions. One's a very general question, but there's also these other questions that are a little bit more particular. And again, these tools, we're using them to screen. This is like the scoring sheet for that tool. And the scoring sheet is supposed to help the professional know what to do with the child once they have gone through the screening. And here's a sort of algorithm for us to use on what to do next. Here's the ages and stages. This one is much more elaborate. It has actually different questionnaires for different age groups. So the PEDS, you can use that so they're across the age span. But the ages and stages, you would use particular one for the the age of the child closest to the age of the child. There's a scoring key again. So these are more elaborate than surveillance. You're going to be screening a child using a particular tool, but they're pretty powerful. Here's an example of one for 4-year-old. Okay, so when we do screening, there's certain resources that we can use, and Verna's already gone over the most important ones, which is that we can have the Department of Health early intervention folks help out, birth to 3. We can also have the Head Start programs help out too. Those are preschool for kids, particularly in lower economic situations. At 3 to 5, and over 5, Verna's already mentioned the special ed programs with the Department of Education. 3 to 5, again, you can have a Head Start. And then over 5 years, there's a lot of other services in addition to special ed, such as Medicaid and other things that we might want to use. So here's the early intervention. So there's a form here that can be used to give information to early intervention program if a professional has screened a child out, and this is general information on the flyer for early intervention. And here's a flyer for the Department of Ed and their whole, sort of process on trying to get kids identified early so that they can get the right help and get special ed and other services. Lots of languages. I love the DOE. They are very good about languages. And then Head Start are on our major islands. And those, again, are programs, preschool programs. So either before 3 or after 3 for kids that could use some supports, like preschool supports before they hit kindergarten. Okay. So, so there's lots of reasons for developmental delay. And again, that is goes into the question on whether or not the developmental delay will get just better, and then we don't have to do things much after it gets better, or if we need to continue to follow kids over time. So there's all kinds of medical conditions that can affect development. We have quite a number of kids with Down syndrome, as an example for genetic conditions. There's neurological conditions like cerebral palsy, which might actually be also considered like an orthopedic condition, but there's also other orthopedic conditions that can affect all of your motor kinds of development. And then the big ones, the developmental disability that tend to be more chronic include autism, spectrum disorder, intellectual disability. So I'll talk about both of those in a little bit. Child abuse and neglect, what I don't like about that is, of course, those are preventable. But what I like about them is that when we work with kids in those situations, they often do get better because we're giving them a lot more psychosocial support as well as developmental supports. And then Verna already mentioned, other issues like poverty and not having exposure, but then injury, of course, can also cause developmental delay. So lots of reasons. Okay, so prior to a child turning 5 years of age, are there continued delays, or sorry, before they turn 9 years of age, are there continued delays? And is there any other category in the educational world or condition in the medical world that can make sense for the child? So again, we cannot use developmental delay, once they hit 9. Okay, so I think Verna's covered the IDA law very nicely. And there's a number of categories for the Department of Ed services. And so again, they can use developmental delay, but only until a certain age. So what I wanted to highlight are there kids that are in other categories, and how do we figure that out? And I'll just highlight these 3. Some of these other ones are a little bit self-explanatory, right? So there's some kids who are deaf, hard of hearing, but also deaf and blind. So, there are certain things that create situations for kids that we, of course, want to give them additional supports in their school program. But I'll talk about these 3: autism, intellectual disability, and specific learning disabilities. So if there's parents out there that have a child in the developmental delay category, I'll show you what kind of needs to go into further thinking about those kids. So most professionals really know about this thing called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. And it has a lot of different mental health disorders, but it has a whole portion on neurodevelopmental diagnoses. And most professionals actually really follow these criteria. It's so that we're not so loosey-goosey about whether or not somebody has a particular condition or not. So I kind of like it because it has a certain amount of rigor. And so for autism spectrum disorder, there's a particular criteria, and I'm not going to go over it, but it really has to do with social communication, interaction. You have to make all of 3 of these criteria. And you have to have 2 out of the 4 criteria for restrictive and repetitive behavior. And so for your child to actually be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, the professional is supposed to actually cover those big 2 domains, the social communicative and the restrictive and repetitive behavior. Now for intellectual disability, the DSM talks about you have to have sort of 3 parts to that definition. One is deficits in intellectual functioning. And the way that most of the professionals figure that out is to do an IQ test, or to have somebody do an IQ test. And here's a number of IQ tests. And most of the time when you see the word intelligence in the testing label, or cognitive, then you kind of know it's kind of an IQ test. And then the second part of the definition for intellectual disability is you have to have impairments in adaptive functioning. And it's all in these sort of areas for daily living: communication, social skills, school or work functioning, and then independence at home or in community settings. And the main way that we measure adaptive functioning in the professional world is to look at tools that look at these areas. The school system particularly, I noticed, likes to use the Vineland-3 or the ABAS-3, and that's also very popular in the community of psychologists that do outside of school testing also. But there's quite a number of assessments, and all of these are sort of informant driven. So unlike the IQ test where you have to do it directly with the child, these you usually do it with a teacher or a parent that knows the child well. And in the DOE, it looks like it's usually done by a social worker. Okay, and then the third part.
5 minutes left, Dr.
Thank you, perfect. And then the third part is that they have to have it within the developmental period. So most people say that that's childhood and adolescence, usually up to 18 years of age. Okay, so the DSM-5 uses both the IQ and the adaptive functioning assessments to figure out whether or not they have this condition and whether or not they can be in the category for intellectual disability in the DOE. Okay, and then learning disabilities, it's a little bit different. So it's also in the DSM-5. They have problems with math or writing or reading. So unlike intellectual disability, which is more global, learning disabilities are more specific. And doing testing for a learning disability, you have to be really careful about just not using one test to make that decision. But there's a number of tests, so I'll kind of try to go over those. These are achievement tests that are more global, and you can see each of these have the word achievement in their name, really kind of helping us out knowing what kind of test it is. And then there's these visual motor integration tests that can also be used. Here's an example. So you're going to tell the child to do this drawing and just look at this and make it here. And I have to tell you, us adults, we have problems with these over here, right? These are tough to do even when you're an adult, but you're going to try to figure out if they have a visual motor issue, which is also related to a possible learning disability. And then there's language tests that we can use. Okay, so here's just a cartoon about some learning disabilities we can figure out. One is go-kartitis. Instead of focusing on the topic at hand, has fantasies about go-karts. And here's some other clock watching disorder. I think I used to have that disorder at one point. Okay, so I just want to end by talking about the interface between medicine and education. So Verna very nicely went over the IEPs and IFSPs and how, you know, we have certain guidances in terms of determining if a child could, you know, benefit from special education supports. And they have a lot of jargon for that. Us medical people, we have lots of jargon too, but we, of course, do physical exams and growth measurements to try to figure out if we can identify conditions that's affecting the child. We tend to do a lot of hearing and vision screening. We can do blood tests. We can have subspecialists involved, lots of things on the medical side. But in between is sort of like this whole developmental delay thing. We have to work together to try to figure out, okay, so if the child's not going to be in the developmental delay category pretty soon, what category would the child be in? Or is it that the child's so much better now that, you know, the child doesn't require an IEP and ongoing special education? But there's a number of things that we work on together. So emergency action plans. So some kids in schools need some kind of plan when they have a seizure or for their diabetes care. We, of course, have some kids on medications in school. And then we both have responsibilities on linking children to other agencies. And then I put Special Parent Information Network because, yeah, that's a good example of an interface, right? Verna and I have both been invited to give a talk together, and it's, you know, totally representing the interface between medicine and education. Okay, so those are my slides. I'm really happy and look forward to taking some questions. I haven't been monitoring the chat, so hopefully Verna can answer some questions while I look at that.
Great. Thank you so much, you guys, for the wonderful presentations. Yeah, we have a couple of questions. One you answered during your presentation, which I think you saw earlier in the chat. There's another one that came through. Is there an advantage of making a student eligible under developmental delay 3 through 5 instead of ID or ASD if they meet the criteria?
You know, typically there's the reason developmental delay is in there is because for the real little ones, there is a time when it's kind of unknown, you know, as Dr. Okamoto said, they're so young that it's difficult. Like a child might be delayed in their talking and then all of a sudden they blossom, you know, so that's a stage that there's a lot of unknowns. So that's why developmental delay is there. There are situations, as he referred to, like a child has Down syndrome, that it's pretty obvious from the very start. In the situations where it is pretty clear cut, they're meeting all of the criteria, it is best to go with the eligibility category of, say, intellectual disability or autism spectrum disorder, if it is known. If we have the overwhelming evidence or a lot of data to support that eligibility category. Developmental delay is when we're still kind of unsure. And that's why, so by the time they reach the age of 8, we've had those opportunities to work with them in preschool. Then when they're school age, by the time they turn 9 years old, the school should really have a pretty good idea of the eligibility category. That being said, whatever their eligibility category is, the Department of Education is still required to address the needs that are impacting education. So if we cannot just say, well, they have an eligibility category, therefore they need these particular services. We need to look at services in terms of how is it impacting education.
Yeah, to add to that, so the average age to diagnose a child with autism spectrum disorder currently is 4 years of age across the United States, right? So what about the 3-year-olds, right? So, so some kids actually are going to be diagnosed later on with something, but we want to be able to give them supports before, that whole machinery to get that done actually happens for the particular child. Mhm.
There's a question about SPED. So after 8 years old, kids can't qualify for SPED under developmental delay.
That is correct. We would be looking at a different category, eligibility category. So when Dr. Okamoto put all those eligibility categories up on the screen, there's like specific learning disability, speech or language, we would be looking at some of those other categories after the age. Mhm.
Someone asked a question in the chat also. What happens after a student graduates high school? Are there services for these people?
You would be very interested in all of the work that a number of organizations are doing about that particular transition. We recognize that that actually is a huge transition period where kids are maybe even losing some of their doctors, right? So if you have a pediatrician, you're not going to be able to maybe see your pediatrician anymore. If you happen to have a family practice doctor, they can see you, but not your pediatrician. And but that's true also with finishing up with the DOE. A lot of kids can go until 22. Yeah, Verna, for special ed. But after that, yeah, what happens, right? And for me, our goal in our clinical work is for our folks who are milder is to get them to be independent, maybe even go to college. But some folks are not going to maybe be able to do a job. And so that's a huge, I'd say, effort on everybody's parts, including parents, to figure out what are they going to do with that individual when they become an adult.
And kind of a follow-up, do you have some tools to help students with developmental disabilities?
Well, it depends on what the delay is in, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm, mhm.
Go ahead, Verna, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing, that it really kind of depends on the individual child. What we know, though, is that if you think about your own school experiences and how you've become successful academically and in your relationships with other individuals, it's really a lot of schooling is around language and really teaching the children how to understand what is going on in the classroom, and as well as how do I use my language to communicate with others, and really promoting that independence. So there's a lot of emphasis now on reading to your child and making sure that you do books every single night, even if it's for 3 minutes or 5 minutes. That's a great, easy to do kind of activity, but you do it all through. Don't stop at, just because they're 5 or 6 years old. If you have a child who has a disability and they're 10 years old, continue to do the reading to them, talking about what's in that story, having them not just listen and be passive, but explain to you about what happened in the story, or talk about what happened in their during their daily activities. Because the more they practice, the better they'll get at it.
I would also emphasize the role of parents. So like a lot of kids, they can learn from media, but we're learning more and more that when they're watching something on YouTube, if a parent is around to talk about it with them, they'll really learn it a lot better than just passively watching it. So we appreciate family role is really critical, actually. So some of the things that Verna was showing in some of her slides is really true, right? So if for whatever reason parents are busy, or say a parent is using a lot of drugs and so they're kind of incapacitated, those are kids that really, sometimes they actually have underlying very good cognitive and social and other abilities. And once they start having exposure to the right kind of materials, they just blossom, right? So that's of course what we hope with that developmental delay sort of sort of label. But some kids will have something a little bit more serious, like a developmental disability like autism spectrum disorder, and then we're going to have to work with them a little bit longer.
Can you change the developmental delay category sooner than 9 years old?
In the Department of Education, yes, you can. So we do have some children who at the age of, we do that initial evaluation when they are referred to the Department of Education to see if they're eligible. We are required to conduct what we call a reevaluation every 3 years, but it can be sooner. So let's say you have a child who enters at 3 years old, and we're seeing that, there's more going on. We need to problem solve about what's happening here. We may be doing a reevaluation, let's say at the age of 5, and determine that there's a better match with, say, autism spectrum disorder. So it can happen where they shift their eligibility categories sooner. We don't have to wait until they're 8.
Should the eligibility category be used to label my child, or should it not be referenced after the eligibility meeting?
The eligibility category is really to help us identify, match up the concerns and making sure that the concerns are being addressed. And let's take autism spectrum disorder. We could say that the child has a language problem, but a language problem is hugely different for a child who is having difficulty using language to learn how to read and write versus somebody who has a language problem where they're having difficulty communicating and interacting with others. So the eligibility category is important for us to understand how is that disability impacting the child so that we get the right services to them. But really, when it comes to developing their services or their individualized education program, we really have to go back to what is that very disabling condition that is impacting. So for a child with autism, it might be, boy, we really have to work on their ability to interact with others, teach them how to transition so that they're not really stuck in some of these ritualistic kinds of behaviors, and they can transition easily from one activity to another, versus somebody who is having some real difficulties understanding the language so that I can't comprehend what I'm reading. There's a lot of overlap and it's so complicated at times, but really, as Dr. Okamoto kept saying, it's not so much the label, but describing the child. And I think if we think about it more that way, then we're in a better place, that it's really about describing the child's behaviors, describing their actions and those kinds of things.
What Verna's comments make me really appreciate, as I do over and over and over again in my work, is that the DOE has a huge challenge to provide the appropriate services. Yep. And it's so many things that you have to be thinking about. I don't know how to go out there, but I'm glad that they have that role, and my role is to try to help identify kids or illuminate things that we need to work on in the school system. But I imagine that's a huge challenge to, really give the kids proper supports because it's so complicated. Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's so complicated.
All right, one last question. So what should I do if I disagree with the eligibility category suggested by the IEP team?
I think it's really to have that open conversation. I know sometimes it's a little bit difficult to talk about it, but really making sure that the person who is facilitating the meeting should really make sure that all voices are heard, that we're saying we have to hear from the parents, we have to hear from the professionals, but always going back to what is the concern? What is it that brought us to come to this meeting in the first place? So, I think the one good slide that Dr. Okamoto had up was, when we're looking at the very start, and he spelled it out. What is the concern? What is your child having difficulty with? And then we kind of go through the criteria that we have and say, is it really kind of meeting the concern and having that open discussion? The reason we have to have a variety, the law requires us to have a variety of materials, is because we should be looking for patterns to say the data really shows us that these are really big, overwhelming problems here. And that kind of guides us, but it's really having that open discussion.
I think parents often may disagree with something, and actually us professionals sometimes disagree with each other too, right? So I think we all have a right to that, and then to then pursue, right? So we have to reconcile that somehow, and so that's, I think, all of our work, both families and professionals together, to try to figure out how can we reconcile that. Was that something that we just didn't do enough? We didn't do enough assessment, or did we misunderstand things? Did the family misunderstand something? So that's definitely part of the process. But yeah, you should speak out, because if you really don't feel that something seems quite right, then we need to pursue that.
Great, thank you so much, guys. We have 1 minute remaining.
All right, so this is the fun part. I'm gonna take over. Thank you so much, Dr. Akamoto and Verna, for such good, awesome, informative presentations and for taking all the time to answer questions.